Welcome back, guys, to The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. We are now starting on Chapter 3. We got 2 more parts of this to go, and then we're cleared up with yet another masterpiece. I wanted to go back to the beginning of this and connect this story with my life by rereading the first paragraph of this, okay? One morning, as I was waking up from anxious dreams, I discovered that in bed I had been changed into a corndog. Is the first paragraph of this as it pertains to my life. I don't know if that fits in with you as well, but I've found recently that I have in fact metaphorically turned into quite a corndog, and I'm not very pleased with it in some senses. Either way, let's get started on Chapter 3. I've got myself a glass of wine and some fettuccine alfredo, and I'm ready to get poppin' with it, as the kids say. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, subscribe, like, comment, and favorite, as per always. And let's get started with Chapter 3. Let's go. Chapter 3. Gregor's serious wound, from which he suffered for over a month, since no one ventured to remove the apple, it remained in his flesh as a visible reminder, seemed by itself to have reminded that, farther that, in spite of his present unhappy and hateful appearance, Gregor was a member of the family. Something one should not treat as an enemy, and that it was, on the contrary, a requirement of family duty to suppress one's aversion and to endure nothing else, just endure. And if through his wound, Gregor had now apparently lost for good his ability to move, and for the time being needed many minutes to crawl across this room, like an aged invalid. So far as creeping up high was concerned, that was unimaginable. Nevertheless, for this worsening of his condition, in his opinion, he did get completely satisfactory compensation, because every day towards evening, the door to the living room, which he was in the habit of keeping a sharp eye on, even 1 or 2 hours beforehand, was opened, so that he, lying down in the darkness of his room, invisible from the living room, could see the entire family at the illuminated table and listen to their conversation, to a certain extent, with their common permission. A situation quite different from what had happened before. Of course, it was no longer the animated social interaction of former times, about which Gregor in small hotel rooms had always thought about with a certain longing, when, tired out, he had to throw himself in the damp bedclothes. For the most part, what went on now was very quiet. After the evening meal, the father fell asleep quickly in his armchair. The mother and sister talked guardedly to each other in the stillness. Bent far over, the mother sewed fine undergarments for a fashion shop. The sister, who had taken on a job as a salesgirl, in the evening studied stenography and French, so as perhaps later to obtain a better position. Sometimes the father woke up, and, as if he were quite ignorant that he had been asleep, said to the mother, "How long have you been sewing today?" and went right back to sleep, while the mother and sister smiled tiredly to each other. With a sort of stubbornness, the father refused to take off the servant's uniform, even at home, and while his sleeping gown hung unused on the coat hook, the father dozed completely dressed in his place, as if he was ready for his responsibility, and even here was waiting for the voice of his superior. As a result, in spite of all the care of the mother and sister, his uniform, which even at the start was not new, grew dirty, and Gregor looked, often for the entire evening, at this clothing, with stains all over it, and with its gold but always polished buttons, in which the old man, although very uncomfortable, slept peacefully nonetheless. As soon as the clock struck 10, the mother tried encouraging the father gently to wake up, and then persuading him to go to bed, on the ground that he couldn't get a proper sleep here, and the father, who had to report for service at 6 o'clock, really needed a good sleep. But in his stubbornness, which had gripped him since he became a servant, he insisted always on staying even longer by the table, although he regularly fell asleep, and then could only be prevailed upon with the greatest difficulty to trade his chair for the bed. No matter how much the mother and sister might at that point work on him with small admonitions, for a quarter of an hour he would remain shaking his head slowly, his eyes closed, without standing up. The mother would pull him by his sleeve and speak flattering words into his ear. The sister would leave her work and help her mother, but that would not have the desired effect on the father. He would settle himself even more deeply in his armchair. Only when the two women grabbed him under the armpits would he throw his eyes open, look back and forth at the mother and sister, and habitually say, "This is a life. This is the peace and quiet of my old age." And, propped up by both women, he would heave himself up, elaborately, as if for him it was the greatest travail, allow himself to be led to the door by the woman, wave them away, and proceed on his own from there, while the mother quickly threw down her sewing implements and the sister her pen in order to run after the father and help him some more. In this overworked and exhausted family, who had time to worry any longer about Gregor, more than was absolutely necessary? The household was constantly getting smaller. The servant girl was now let go. A huge, bony cleaning woman with white hair flapping all over her head came in that morning and the evening to do the heaviest work. The mother took care of everything else, in addition to her considerable sewing work. It even happened that various pieces of family jewelry, which previously the mother and sister had been overjoyed to wear on social and festive occasions, were sold, as Gregor found out in the evening from the general discussion of the prices they had fetched. But the greatest complaint was always that they could not leave this apartment, which was too big for their present means, since it was now impossible to imagine how Gregor might be moved. But Gregor fully recognized that it was not just consideration for him which was presenting a move, for he could have been transported easily in a suitable box with a few air holes. The main thing holding the family back from a change in living quarters was far more their complete hopelessness and the idea that they had been struck by a misfortune like no one else in their entire circle of relatives and acquaintances. What the world demands of poor people, they now carried out to an extreme degree. The father brought breakfast to the petty officials at the bank. The mother sacrificed herself for the undergarments of strangers. The sister, behind her deck, was at the beck and call of customers, but the family energies did not extend any further, and the wound in his back began to pain Gregor all over again, when now, mother and sister, after they had escorted the father to bed, came back, let their work lie, moved close together, and sat cheek to cheek. And when his mother would now say, pointing to Gregor's room, "Close the door, Greet," and when Gregor was again in the darkness, while close by the woman mingled their tears, or, quite dry-eyed, stared at the table. Gregor spent his nights and days with hardly any sleep. Sometimes he thought that the next time the door opened, he would take over the family arrangements, just as he had earlier. And his imagination appeared again, after a long time. His employer and supervisor and the apprentices, the excessively gormless custodian, 2 or 3 friends from other businesses, the chambermaid from a hotel in the provinces, a loving, fleeting memory, a female cashier from the hat shop, whom he had seriously, but too slowly courted. They all appeared mixed in with strangers or people he had already forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable, and he was happy to see them disappear. But then, he was in no mood to worry about his family. He was filled with sheer anger over the wretched care he was getting, even though he couldn't imagine anything for which he might have an appetite. Still, he made plans about it, how he could take from the larder what all he account deserved, even if he wasn't hungry. Without thinking any more about how one might be able to give Gregor special pleasure, the sister now kicked some food or other very quickly into his room, in the morning and at noon, before she ran off to her shop. And in the evening, quite indifferent about whether the food had perhaps only been tasted or, what happened most frequently, remained entirely undisturbed, she whisked it out with one sweep of her broom. The task of cleaning his room, which she now always carried out in the evening, could not be done any more quickly. Streaks of dirt ran along the walls. Here and there lay tangles of dust and garbage. At first, when his sister arrived, Gregor positioned himself quickly in a particularly filthy corner in order, with this posture, to make something of a protest. But he could have well stayed there for weeks without his sister's changing her ways. Indeed, she perceived the dirt as much as he did, but she had decided to just let it stay. In this business, with a touchiness which was quite new to her, and which had generally taken over the entire family, she kept watch to see that the cleaning of Gregor's room remained reserved for her. Once his mother had undertaken a major cleaning of Gregor's room, which she had only completed successfully after using a few buckets of water. But the extensive dampness made Gregor sick and lay supine, embittered and immobile on the couch. However, the mother's punishment was not delayed for long, for in the evening the sister had hardly observed the change in Gregor's room before she ran into the living room, mightily offended, and in spite of her mother's hand, lifted high in entreaty, broke out into a fit of crying. Her parents, the father had of course woken up with a start in his armchair, at first looked at her astonished, helpless, until they started to get agitated. Turning to his right, the father heaped reproaches on the mother that she was not to take over the cleaning of Gregor's room from the sister, and, turning to his left, he shouted at the sister that she would no longer be allowed to clean Gregor's room ever again, while the mother tried to pull the father, beside himself in his excitement, into the bedroom. The sister, shaken by her crying fit, pounded on the table with her tiny fists, and Gregor hissed at all this, angry that no one thought about shutting the door and sparing him the sight of the commotion. But even when the sister, exhausted from her daily work, had grown tired of caring for Gregor as she had before, even then the mother did not have to come at all on her behalf, and Gregor did not have to be neglected. For now, the cleaning woman was there, this old widow, who in her long life must have managed to survive the worst with the help of her bony frame, had no real horror for Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once by chance opened Gregor's door. At the sight of Gregor, who, totally surprised, began to scamper here and there, although no one was chasing him, she remained standing with her hands folded across her stomach, staring at him. Since then, she did not fail to open the door furtively, a little every morning and evening, and look in on Gregor. At first, she also called him to her with words which she presumably thought were friendly, like, "Come here a little bit, old dung beetle," or, "Hey, look at that old dung beetle," addressed in such a manner. Gregor answered nothing, but remained motionless in his place, as if the door had not been opened at all. If only, instead of allowing this cleaning woman to disturb him uselessly whenever she felt like it, they had instead given her orders to clean up his room every day. One day, in the early morning, a hard downpour, perhaps a sign of the coming spring, struck the window panes, when the cleaning woman started up once again with her usual conversation. Gregor was so bitter that he turned towards her, as if for an attack, although slow and weakly. But instead of being afraid of him, the cleaning woman merely lifted up a chair, standing close by the door, and, as she stood there with her mouth wide open, her intention was clear. She would close her mouth only when the chair in her hand had been thrown down on Gregor's back. "This goes no further, all right?" she asked, as Gregor turned himself around again. Then she placed the chair calmly back in the corner. Gregor ate hardly anything anymore. Only when he chanced to move past the food which had been prepared did he, as a game, take a bit into his mouth, hold it there for hours, and generally spit it out again. At first he thought it might be sadness over the condition of his room which kept him from eating, but he very soon became reconciled to the alterations in his room. People had grown accustomed to put into storage in his room things which they couldn't put anywhere else. And at this point, There were many such things, now that they had rented one room of the apartment to 3 lodgers. These solemn gentlemen, all 3 had full beards, as Gregor once found out through a crack in the door, were meticulously intent on tidiness, not only in their own room, but, since they had now rented a room here, in the entire household, and particularly in the kitchen. They simply did not tolerate any useless or shoddy stuff. Moreover, for the most part, they had brought with them their own pieces of furniture. Thus, many items had become superfluous, and these were not really things one could sell or things people wanted to throw out. All these items ended up in Gregor's room, even the box of ashes and the garbage pail from the kitchen. The cleaning woman, always in a hurry, simply flung anything that was momentarily useless into Gregor's room. Fortunately, Gregor generally saw only the relevant object and the hand which held it. The cleaning woman perhaps was intending, when time and opportunity allowed, to take the stuff out again, or to throw everything out all at once. But in fact, the things remained lying there, wherever they had ended up at the first throw, unless Gregor squirmed his way through the accumulation of junk and moved it. At first, he was forced to do this because otherwise there was no room for him to creep around. And later, he did it with a growing pleasure. Although, after such movements, tired to death and feeling wretched, he didn't budge for hours. Because the lodgers sometimes also took their evening meal at home in the common living room, the door to the living room stayed shut on many evenings. But Gregor had no trouble at all going without the open door. Already on many evenings, when it was open, he had not unveiled himself out of it, but, with the family not noticing, was stretched out in the darkest corner of his room. However, once the cleaning woman had left the door to the living room slightly ajar, and it remained open even when the lodgers came in the evening and the lights were put on, they sat down at the head of the table, where in earlier days the mother, the father, and Gregor had eaten, unfolded their serviettes, and picked up their knives and forks. The mother immediately appeared in the door with a dish of meat, and right behind her, the sister, with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food gave off a lot of steam. The gentlemen lodgers bent over the plate set before them, as if they wanted to check it before eating. And in fact, the one who sat in the middle, for the other 2 he seemed to serve as the authority, cut off a piece of meat still on the plate, obviously to establish whether it was sufficiently tender and whether or not something should be shipped back to the kitchen. He was satisfied. Then mother and sister, who had looked on in suspense, began to breathe easily and smile. The family itself ate in the kitchen. In spite of that, before the father went into the kitchen, he came into the room with a single bow, cap in hand, made a tour of the table. The lodgers rose up collectively and murmured something in their beards. Then, when they were alone, they ate almost in complete silence. It seemed odd to Gregor that out of all the many different sorts of sounds of eating, what was always audible was their chewing teeth. As if by that, Gregor should be shown that people needed their teeth to eat, and that nothing could be done even with the most handsome of toothless jawbones. "I really do have an appetite," Gregor said to himself sorrowfully, "but not for these things. How these lodgers stuff themselves, and I'm dying." On this very evening, Gregor didn't remember hearing the violin all through this period. It sounded from the kitchen. The lodgers had already ended their night meal. The middle one had pulled out a newspaper and had given each of the other 2 a single page, and they were now leaning back, reading and smoking. When the violin started playing, they became attentive, got up, and went on tiptoe to the hall door, at which they remained standing, pressed up against one another. They must have been audible from the kitchen, because the father called out, perhaps the gentlemen don't like the playing. It can be stopped at once. Oh, on the contrary, stated the lodger in the middle. Might the young woman not come into us and play in the room here where it is really much more comfortable and cheerful? Oh, thank you, cried the father, as if he were the one playing the violin. The men stepped back into the room and waited. Soon the father came with the music stand, and the mother with the sheet music, and the sister with the violin. The sister calmly prepared everything for the recital. The parents, who had never previously rented a room and therefore exaggerated their politeness to the lodgers, dared not sit on their own chairs. The father leaned against the door, his right hand stuck between the two buttons of his buttoned-up uniform. The mother, however, accepted a chair offered by one lodger. Since she left the chair sit where the gentleman had chanced to put it, she sat to one side in the corner. The sister began to play. The father and the mother followed attentively, one on each side, the movements of their hands. Attracted by the playing, Gregor had ventured to advance a little further forward, and his head was already in the living room. He scarcely wondered about the fact that recently he had had so little consideration for the others. Earlier, this consideration had been something he was proud of. And for that very reason, he would have had, at this moment, more reason to hide away. Because, as a result of the dust which lay all over his room and flew around with the slightest movement, he was totally covered in dirt. On his back and his sides, he carted around him with dust, threads of hair, remnants of food. His indifference to everything was much too great for him to lie on his back and scour himself on the carpet, as he had often done earlier in the day. In spite of his condition, he had no timidity about inching forward a bit on the spotless floor of the living room. In any case, no one paid him any attention. The family was all caught up in the violin playing. The lodgers, by contrast, who had, for the moment, placed themselves, their hands in their trouser pockets, behind the music stand, much too close to the sister, so that they could all see the sheet music, something that must certainly bother the sister, soon drew back to the window, conversing in low voices with bowed heads, where they remained, worriedly observed by the father. It now seemed really clear that, having assumed that they were to hear a beautiful or entertaining violin recital, they were now disappointed, and were allowing their peace and quiet to be disturbed only out of politeness. The way in which they all blew the smoke from their cigars out of their noses and mouths in particular led one to conclude that they were very irritated. And yet, his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was turned to the side. Her gaze followed the score intently and sadly. Gregor crept forward, still a little further, and kept his head close against the floor in order to be able to catch her gaze if possible. Was he an animal that music so seized him? For him, it was as if the way to the unknown nourishment he craved was revealing itself to him. He was determined to press forward, right to his sister, to tug at her dress, and to indicate to her in this way that she might still come with her violin into his room. Because here, no one valued the recital as he wanted to value it. He did not wish to let her go from his room any more, at least not as long as he lived. His frightening appearance would for the first time become useful for him. He wanted to be at all doors of his room simultaneously, and to snarl back at the attackers. However, his sister should not be compelled, but would remain with him voluntarily. She would sit next to him on the sofa, bend down near to him, and he would then confide in her that he firmly intended to set her to the conservatory, and that, if his misfortune had not arrived on the interim, he would have declared all this last Christmas, had Christmas really already come and gone, and would have brooked no argument. After this explanation, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would lift himself to her armpit and kiss her throat, which she, from the time she started going to work, had left exposed without a band or a collar. That'll do it, fellows, for part 1 of chapter 3 of The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is Sleepless Tales, signing out momentarily. I just want to remind you that I love you, and I want you to have a great night. And if you don't, I'm going to turn you into a corn dog, and we can both be bedfellows. Say to myself, wow. Wait, I can't say that. You can't say that on radio. These females, really, these females have been treating me like a corn dog, only wanting my meat when I got bread. It's not what I meant by that. Initially, it comes to mind, these individuals act with me like I'm Little Caesars, because I got crazy bread, but low quality meat. It's the exact opposite joke, actually. Well, anyways, you have a great night. Goodbye.